I remember learning a lot about Canada's involvement in World War II back in high school, from how D-Day was actually planned in Quebec City to how Canada was instrumental in freeing the Netherlands from Nazi control. But how surprised was I to learn that the Nazis actually had a secret plan to set up a weather station in Canada, and that one of them was actually a success. During the Second World War, Nazi Germany was at a disadvantage to the Allied forces fighting in Europe. See, in the temperate zones of the Northern Hemisphere, the strongest winds usually go from west to east. This is why in the wintertime in Toronto or Montreal, we can expect a snowstorm a couple days ahead of time just by seeing what the weather's like today in Winnipeg. Anyways, the Allies had Canada and the United States to let Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the other Allied forces know what the weather was going to be like ahead of time. The Nazis needed better weather reports, especially since the Americans had joined the war, and so they developed the Wetterfunkgerätland automatic weather stations. The stations were made up of an array of measuring instruments and equipment to transmit these measurements back to Germany automatically. These WFL stations were made up of a bunch of different measuring instruments and transmission equipment that would send the measurements back to Germany automatically. They consisted of 10 cylindrical canisters, each about a meter in height and 1.5 meters around, weighing about 200 pounds each. One canister contained most of the measuring and transmitting equipment, while the other canisters were mostly just battery packs, meant to keep the station operational for up to 6 months. 26 of these WFL stations were developed by the Siemens company, the same company that makes everything from CT scanners to trains today. And 14 of them were deployed to different areas around the north, all the way from Greenland to Spitsbergen to Franz Josef Land in the Soviet Union, while 2 others were destined for North America. The first of the 2 did make it, however, thankfully the second didn't when the U-boat that was carrying it was sunk after a British air attack off the coast of Bergen, Norway. The first station destined for North America, WFL-26, was codenamed Kurt, and it sailed out of Kiel, Germany on September 18, 1943, on board U-boat 537 under the command of Captain Lieutenant Peter Schrew. The U-boat also carried a team of meteorologists to set up the weather station, and the team was led by someone who also happened to be named Kurt. En route to North America, the U-boat was struck and battered around hard by a storm, which caused leaks in the hull and damage to the anti-aircraft cannon. This meant that the U-boat could no longer dive, and it could no longer defend itself from fire from Allied aircraft. However, it continued slowly west and made it to the northernmost point of Labrador by October 1943. On the 22nd of October, the U-boat, its crew, and Kurt arrived at the northeastern tip of Labrador in Martin Bay, far enough, Captain Schrew thought, from any Inuit communities and thus any prying Allied eyes. Obviously, just sitting at the surface in the middle of a bay, the U-boat was a sitting duck for any British or Canadian aircraft that could be passing overhead, and so they had to act quickly. The crew of the German U-boat was divided into 3 groups. The first was going to help the meteorologist carry Kurt up the hill and set it up on the top of the peninsula. The second would stay back at the U-boat and make repairs for the crossing back to occupied France. And the third armed group would act as guards, standing on the high points around the peninsula to watch for any intruders. However, there was only one intruder that came to see what was going on, a polar bear that the Germans quickly shot and killed. And before leaving, they camouflaged it. They threw empty American cigarette packets around so any local Inuit that might stumble upon the site would think that the Americans set it up. And just to be sure, they painted the Canadian Meteor Service right across the side, even though that didn't actually exist. Ironically, Martin Bay and all of Labrador wasn't actually a part of Canada at the time. It was still a part of the Dominion of Newfoundland. And so anyone who might have stumbled upon it would have probably noticed that. No matter, the Germans tested that Kurt was operational, and then they set sail back for Europe, landing in Nazi-occupied France later that December. Kurt worked just as planned for the first few days, sending weather reports back to German officers every few hours. But inexplicably, the weather station stopped working after only 1 month. So the Germans decided to send another to North America, which, as I mentioned earlier, thankfully was sunk in the Atlantic by a British airplane. Kurt would remain at Martin Bay in Labrador as left by the Nazis for almost 40 years. That is until it was discovered by Peter Johnston, a scientist who was doing work in the area in 1977. He noticed the station and the Canadian Meteor Service inscription, and so he thought it was a Canadian military installation and noted it and left it where it was. 4 years later, a retired engineer from Siemens was writing a book on the history of the company when he stumbled on the records of the weather station program, the information on the location of Kurt, and decided to inform the Canadian Department of National Defense. In 1981, the department traveled to Martin Bay and found that Kurt was still there, although many of the canisters were now open and some of the contents were thrown about the site. The Canadian government moved Kurt to Ottawa, where it's now permanently on display at the Canadian War Museum in downtown, as a reminder that the Nazis actually made it to North America, and that the war made it a little bit closer to home than many of us might actually think. Thank you everyone for coming by and checking out this episode of Canada Explained. We really appreciate it when you leave us a comment, like the video, and subscribe. As a small YouTube channel, it means a lot and it goes a long way to helping us out. And please let us know in the comments below what other interesting Canada topics you want us to talk about in upcoming videos. We're really happy to hear your suggestions. See you next time!